Welcome to Conversations on Healthcare with Mark Maselli and Margaret Flinter. This week we welcome Dr. Nicholas Christakis of Yale's Human Nature Lab on the enduring impact of COVID-19. Now, here's Mark Maselli and Margaret Flinter.
We're speaking today with Yale sociologist and epidemiologist Dr. Nicholas Christakis, director of the Human Nature Lab and co-director of the Yale Institute for Network Science. He's Sterling Professor of Social and Natural Science at Yale University.
His research is focused on how human health and biology are impacted by social networks. He's written over 200 articles and several books, including his latest, Apollo's Arrow, the profound and enduring impact of coronavirus on the way we live, now out on paperback. Dr. Christakis, we welcome you back to Conversations on Healthcare today.
Call me Nicholas, and thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Mark.
All right,
Perfect.
Nicholas, thank you so much, and what a great read. Apollo's Arrow, and you wrote it up in Vermont, ensconced as many people were, trying to find a safe place right at the height of the pandemic. And it seemed to have provided you a fertile testing ground for many of the theories that you've expounded upon on social networks and health. And you said that you were appalled and ashamed by how badly our country did in the crisis. What surprised and captivated you most about the behaviors you witnessed as the pandemic rolled over our shores?
Well, I think it's very important to understand that these respiratory pandemics come every 10 or 20 years, and serious ones come every 50 or 100 years. And it's not like we were incapable of anticipating what might happen to us. I mean, this way we've come to live right now feels very alien and unnatural, but it's none of those things. I mean, plagues are an ancient part of human experience. They're in the Bible. They're in the Iliad, in one of the oldest works of Western literature that we have. They're in Shakespeare. They're in Cervantes. We have expertise in our society. We have medical historians. We have epidemiologists. Tony Fauci was writing about respiratory pandemics when I was in high school. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of knowledge and tradition about this. And so it's very important to understand first that plagues are not new to our species. They're just new to us. So we think this is crazy what's happening to us, but it's not. First point. So they come every 10 or 20 years. We have respiratory pandemics. Every 50 or 100 years, we have a serious pandemic. And in these pandemics have rightly been seen as national security threats for decades by Republican and Democratic administrations. And so you would think we would have been better prepared. And I don't think anyone looking at the American response would say that we've done a good job. And we can talk about that if you want, about the ways in which we've not done a good job.
Well, I guess they do come every 50 to 100 years, but having been in healthcare all my adult life, it still was a little bit of a surprise to me how things played out, especially as we saw it beginning to roll up on the shores in March of 2020. And maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was, that not all people are inclined to act for the public good. And we really saw this play out with masking. And I think you described this in your book. I wear a mask to protect you. You wear a mask to protect me. Therefore, we all wear a mask. Didn't so much happen. We have a life-saving vaccine. Still a lot of people refusing it, or worse, convincing others not to get it. You've made the point that maybe altruism needs to be enforced in a crisis of this magnitude. What do you mean by that? And can you ever enforce altruism?
Well, I know that sounds oxymoronic, and the title for that was picked. Article titles you're referring to an article I published in the Atlantic a couple of weeks ago. I didn't pick that title. But the gist of the idea is that a plague is a collective threat. There's certain kind of threats that our species confronts that are collective in nature. For example, being attacked by an invading army, or we're trying to bring down in our evolutionary past, we're trying to kill a mastodon, right? It takes like 20 people working together. Otherwise they get, a mastodon can squash any one of us acting alone. Right. So we evolved a set of tools in our evolutionary past to cope with these types of collective challenges. And these tools include sort of light pressure that we pose on each other. One of the examples I give is that when we leave our house in the morning, we all put on our clothes. And we put on our clothes because of social norms, right? We've sort of agreed that this is what we're going to do, and we don't necessarily enforce that. You know, we don't like punish you necessarily if you go out poorly dressed or inadequately dressed. Anyway, those are examples of light pressure by which we work together to create a kind of collective, a kind of society that we want to live in. But we've also evolved capacities to up the ante. For example, we've evolved the capacity for punishment. And if you think about that, think about the times, for example, when you've seen someone act poorly on a highway and you beep your horn. You're kind of administering a small admonition. You're like trying to, in a very light way. I mean, there's no, beeping your horn doesn't actually punish someone. And on up from that, of course, we've evolved all kinds of other ways to, if people act in an antisocial way, we sanction them. And we also evolved to live in slightly non-egalitarian societies. We evolved to have leaders and to like a little bit of leadership, not too much. We don't like extreme autocracy, but we also don't like complete egalitarianism either. So these are these desires for policing, these capacities for punishment, this taste for conformity, which can also be bad, by the way. These are all tools we evolved to try to get us to work together when we need to, in order to confront very particular kinds of threats that threaten us as a whole. And a plague is such a threat. So your failure to wear a mask or your failure to be vaccinated can harm me. It's not just something about your choices. And therefore, that is a collective threat. And therefore, we are wont to use some of these ancient tools that we evolved to kind of get us to work together to confront the threat. That's, again, a very long-winded answer. But the gist is that coping with a plague requires a certain amount of cooperation. And to the extent that we don't cooperate, our response is inadequate to our individual and collective detriment.
It seems to me what fed the threats, and you walk through this history of the pandemics, but what certainly added to the threat was some bad actors and misinformation that were going on at the same time, right? But what seems to be different this time is that the misinformation had a force multiplier in its spread called Facebook, which, as we know, is currently being scrutinized for allowing false information about the pandemic and vaccine really to thrive on that platform. It's kind of interesting. I was reading your book, and the first part of the book is probably in August of 2020, and I didn't see the lens of maybe Facebook in that, or as you were sort of coming out of it in May and June of this year, right, where we were doing that. But maybe now, how would you apply the lens of what we now know about Facebook as you think about the history of this? Yes, there have been bad actors, misinformation, but at this level before, have we witnessed something? And what's your sense about the role that Facebook played in compromising our response to the pandemic?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up again, because your first question was actually a question about how our response was inadequate. And I gave a very abstract and broad answer, and I had wanted to eventually return to a specific ways it was inadequate. And one of the ways it was inadequate is that as a nation, both our leaders and our citizenry happily engaged in denial. Now, denial and misinformation are ancient features and plagues. We have accounts going back hundreds of years, thousands of years of people spreading rumors, lies, superstitions. The emergence of quack doctors selling all kinds of nostrums that don't work have been described for thousands of years and recognized as such by our ancestors. There's a wonderful account, I think it was the plague of Justinian 1500 years ago, of a commentator, but it might have been another one, very ancient plague, where a commentator says, the rumors have spread in the city. The city was being afflicted by a plague that if you throw pots from the second floor of your house and the pots crash on the street, it will ward off the danger, the plague. And this observer said, now, he goes, because of this crazy superstition among the inhabitants of the city, it's more dangerous to walk through the city for fear of being hit by a pot than it is because of the plague.
Keeps everybody inside.
Yes. Yeah. Well, actually, if you think about it, maybe that's how it might work. But the point is that people have been spreading superstitions and rumors about plagues and also engaged in denial. Because, of course, nobody wants to believe that we are about to be afflicted by such a catastrophe. So denial is a normal human psychological defense. But here's the problem. Our denial was, first of all, and our lies about the plague were facilitated by these online media, which I'll come back to. But relatedly or distinctly, we had another problem, which was our leaders lied to us. I understand the human desire for denial. I understand the fact that lies are a part of plagues. In fact, I had to write about it. But you would expect the White House, as the plague was bearing down on us, not to engage in denial. I understand that other leaders of other wealthy democracies also were incompetent, although not all were. Angela Merkel did a good job. Kyriakos Mitsotakis in Greece did a good job. Lucinda Ardern did a good job in New Zealand. There were leaders of rich democracies that did good jobs. So it's not it's not an excuse, in my view. I expect more from the United States. I expect more from the president. And I understand that there's a normal human desire to deny what's happening, but not from the president. The president was saying, it'll go away. It will go away. When there were 5 cases, it will go away. When there were 50 cases, it will go away. When there were 500 cases, it will go away. When there are 5,000 cases, it will go away. It never went away. He kept saying it would go away. And just to be clear, so I'm not seen as overly political, they were also Democratic governors who were incompetent and weren't taking this threat seriously. But the White House is the White House. And we now know the White House was capably advised by the NSA and the CDC about the nature of this threat. I and my epidemiologist colleagues knew that this was going to be a serious pandemic by the end of January 2020. And if I knew that, it is quite reasonable to expect that the president of the United States would have more information than me.
And one would hope.
Yes, one would hope. And so we now know this to be true, and this was ignored to our great peril. Let me be clear. From the moment this virus leapt into our species and started spreading, a certain amount of our fate was sealed. Hundreds of thousands of Americans were going to die. This is a bad pathogen that killed many people. And in fact, when I published the book when I finished it in August of 2020, I said that between 500,000 and 1 million Americans would die. And we're now at 750,000 and we'll probably approach 1 million, which was the upper limit of what I had said would happen early on. And it was possible to anticipate this, by the way, and we can talk about how epidemiological models allowed experts to know that this was going to happen. So it was possible to know what was going to happen in this situation, and we rightly would have expected the White House to act accordingly and to prepare our country for this, to provide for PPE, to get ventilators, to get testing to work, to prepare the American people with facts and information for the shared challenge that we would face and for the need for sacrifice. We would have to sacrifice some of our liberties. We would have to sacrifice some of our lives. We would have to sacrifice some of our money, which is what we're doing now in the form of higher taxes are going to be required to pay for all the response. This is not going to be easy. And instead, I remember now, from the moment the virus was loose, we were going to lose a couple of 100,000 lives. But if we had acted better, we would not have lost as many lives. Mm-hmm. We have, in my view, lost several 100,000 more Americans than we needed to have lost had we acted with greater alacrity and prudence and sagacity.
And hopefully not to be repeated in the same way. So along those lines, we've been following your work for quite a while, Nicholas. And if we shift our attention for a minute from maybe Washington to Cambridge, we remember the very interesting work at Harvard that you did a few years ago on social networks and how things spread through social networks. I think you've looked at both happiness and influenza. And that data provides insights into how we could do better at predictive surveillance. We know we have a much greater capacity to collect data from all sorts of sources, but we didn't really leverage those tools to get out in front of the COVID crisis. Maybe we hadn't felt the need to do that before. But looking forward, I hope everyone is committed to not experiencing the next pandemic in the same way. What are your thoughts? How do we build a better working data surveillance system for future disease outbreaks? We know that this work is going on around the world and in our country. What do you think about that?
So let me give a two-part answer, if I might, to that. One is a sort of a geeky answer to the paper you're alluding to, which I think might interest some listeners. It's sort of There's some cool ideas there. And the other is a broader response having to do with the what other experts predict about the pace of pandemic disease in the future and why we might want to be better prepared. So the first part of my answer, on the geeky part, the state of epidemic monitoring in our country in the past, for example, annual influenza monitoring, was typically that there were reporting laboratories around the country and facilities, and they would, as people were tested for influenza or other diseases, would send those reports to the CDC where they would be aggregated, such that with some lag, 4 to 6 weeks from now, the CDC might have a sense of what was happening in the country today. In other words, it would take time for all these reports to accumulate, to be processed, combined, analyzed, and understood. So 4 to 6 weeks from now, we might know what was happening in our country today. About 10 or 15 years ago now, Larry Brilliant and his colleagues published a paper that influenced people a lot on using big data techniques. For example, using Google searches for flu symptoms on Google to be able to instantly know, based on the aggregate observation in real time of people's behavior, where the epidemic is today. Now, that paper has since been, there's been a lot of conversation about those methods in that paper, but that's not the purpose of my conversation right now. I'm just saying that there were these ideas that we could use real-time monitoring of some kind of data, whether it's search behavior, whether it's human mobility data, something my lab has done, to get a sense of where an epidemic is today. But we published a paper that you're alluding to about 10 years ago that showed that it was possible to use certain tricks to predict where the epidemic would be in the future. And the trick is this: if you imagine a social network, you should have the intuition that some people will be in the middle of the network. They'll have many friends, and their friends will have many friends, and others will be at the periphery. So if we can identify people who are in the center of the network, you should have the intuition that something that's spreading in the network, whether it's a germ or gossip, will reach the popular people in the middle of the network sooner. Popular people will be in touch with what's happening gossip-wise, or actually also be more likely to get the flu earlier in the course of the epidemic. Anything that spreads through the network is going to reach them quickly and soon, whereas the average person will be reached at the average time, and the peripheral person will be reached by the germ late in the course of the epidemic. So our innovation was to say, if you could identify such central people in networks using certain tricks and passively monitor them, you would know they would be like canaries in a coal mine. They would forecast the course of the epidemic. And in fact, this is why early in COVID-19, all these movie stars and politicians, remember we were talking about them, were getting sick because they are popular. They're interacting with lots of people. They're shaking lots of hands. They're out and about. Their jobs require them to have social interactions. It's not just that they were celebrities and so we heard about their COVID. They actually were more likely to get sick. So monitoring popular people is a way to predict, like a canary in a coal mine, where the epidemic will be in the future. And in fact, my laboratory has been working on some techniques of this kind that allow such forecasting, not only for epidemics, but also for product adoption, for what are going to be popular toys or ideas and memes and so on in the future. Anyway, so that's the geeky part. But the more serious part of the answer to your question, which has to do with, should we as a people be concerned about this now that we've been taught a lesson, so to speak? And keep in mind that the plague we've just had is a kind of plague light. This pathogen is a serious pathogen. It kills 1% of the people that it infects, but only 1%. Things like smallpox or cholera or bubonic plague or Ebola kill huge fractions of the people they infect. So we should count ourselves lucky that we are dealing with this pathogen. This pathogen could have been so much worse. There's no God-given reason this pathogen doesn't kill 10% or 30% of the people it infects. Like in the movie Contagion, that pathogen killed about 1 out of 3 people it infected. Just imagine if that was what was facing. We could have been facing that. I don't think the American people yet realize the full extent of damage done by this plague and the extent of damage that could have been done by this plague had the pathogen been a little bit worse genetically, nor do they realize how much damage could be done by other plagues in the future, which is what you're asking about. And here is what I can say about that. Other scientists have been studying the frequency with which new pathogens move from wild animals into our species. And many listeners will just, in the course of their lives, be aware HIV was such a disease. These are called zoonotic diseases, diseases of animals that come to humans, HIV, Zika, SARS-1 in 2003, hantavirus, now the SARS-2 that we've had, influenza from 1918, the great influenza. These are all diseases that started in animals, spread to humans. And there's evidence that these diseases are rising, that there are more and more of them. And even in our lifetimes, you're reading more reports of these diseases.
Right.
Partly because of climate change, believe it or not, there's a connection between pandemics and climate change and population growth. So we're coming into greater contact with wild animals and we're getting their diseases. First point. Second point, there's evidence that respiratory pandemics as a subset of all plagues are also increasing in frequency, that the duration between them is shortening. So all of this should give us tremendous concern that although we're putting the COVID-19 pandemic behind us within a year or two or three, new ones might be on the horizon. So we need to prepare our public health infrastructure and ourselves for this possibility.
We're speaking today with Yale sociologist and epidemiologist, Dr. Nicholas Christakis, director of the Human Nature Lab and co-director of the Yale Institute for Network Science. He's the author of Apollo's Arrow, The Profound and Enduring Impact of Coronavirus on the Way We Live. Dr. Christakis, talk a little bit about the enduring ways the pandemic will continue to impact our lives. And you say it's in the short term, a couple of years, but there's also a longer term implication. And we've seen vaccine science and research has exploded. The new mRNA platform, not new, it's been around for a while, but new to being utilized so effectively. And we saw this boom in telehealth as well sort of occur during the pandemic. What changes do you think or hope for will endure beyond this phase of the pandemic? And certainly that's got to be strengthening the infrastructure both nationally and internationally in terms of both making sure our scientists are prepared, but also our political leaders are prepared. But look into your crystal ball and tell us what might be coming.
Well, I would say a few things again, typical Nicholas response. First, on an overarching level, this pathogen is going to become endemic, right? It's going to be with us forever. It's going to enter into the background risks that we all face. Eventually, when we look, what's going to happen now is every person on the planet, with few exceptions, hermits that live in the mountains, a small percentage of lucky people, either will be infected by the virus or will get vaccinated. Those are your choices. And if you get infected with the virus, you run a 1% chance of death. If you get vaccinated, you have like a 1 in a million chance. It's obvious you should get vaccinated just from that point of view. And we're going to all have to wait until we reach a very high percentage of people that have been acquired immunity, either because of vaccination or naturally, till we reach this so-called herd immunity threshold. And at that point, the epidemic growth phase of the virus will stop. There'll just be a few cases in the background, just like we think of measles. None of us are worried about epidemic measles. Mm-hmm. Once in a while, there's an outbreak. If measles rates fall down, there's an occasional case of measles in this country every year, but it's really not something we're worried about because enough of us have been immunized that we don't have epidemic measles. That's sort of what's going to happen with COVID. It's going to eventually become endemic. But first point. Second point, you can think of the pandemic as having three phases. The immediate phase, which is when we're feeling the biological and epidemiological shock of the virus as the virus rips through our species. That's going to last until 2022 when we reach this herd immunity threshold. Then we're going to put the epidemic phase of the virus behind us, but we're going to have to clean up the mess. We're going to have to cope with the clinical, psychological, social, and economic aftershocks of the virus during the intermediate phase. And that'll take until 2024, judging from past pandemics. And then we will enter the post-pandemic phase, which I think is going to be a little bit of a party. In the intermediate phase, it's like a tsunami washed ashore, devastated the countryside. Finally, the waters recede, but we've got a big mess to clean up. If you think about it, one thing that's not getting enough conversation is the fact that probably 5 times as many people as die of the germ will become disabled. I'm not talking about short or long COVID. I'm saying you've recovered, but your body has been harmed. You've got pulmonary fibrosis, cardiac problems, renal insufficiency, neurologic or psychiatric deficits, pancreatic problems. We know that this pathogen can affect many organ systems. We estimate that probably 5 times as many people as die of this pathogen will have some kind of long-term disability. If 1 million Americans die, that's 5 million Americans are going to need the care of the healthcare system. This will cost money. It will be a burden to our system. And keep in mind, as a benchmark, we have 750,000 Americans with end-stage renal disease. So 5 million more Americans with disability is not a joke. So we're going to have to cope with that during this intermediate phase. We're going to have to get care for these people. We're going to have to cope with the psychological aftershocks. People will be grieving the loss of their loved ones. Millions of children have missed school. Millions of workers have lost their jobs. These people have psychological deficits as a result of this. Economic problems we're going to have to deal with. We're borrowing trillions of dollars from the future right now. Larry Summers and David Cutler, a health economist at Harvard, published a paper that called this the $16 trillion virus. $8 trillion in economic damage and $8 trillion in loss of life, disability, and illness. This is an economic catastrophe that surpasses the Great Depression. And people don't see it yet because we're borrowing money from the future to cover up right now what's happening. We're going to have to repay that debt. This is as if the homes of tens of millions of Americans had just been burnt to the ground. The destruction of wealth caused by this virus, in addition to the destruction of life, is huge. And people, I don't think, quite get it yet. So we're going to have to deal with all that. But eventually, we will enter the post-pandemic phase. We will put all this behind us because life does return to normal. Plagues always end. And, our ancestors have been through plagues before, and here we are after plagues that have happened in the past. Plagues always end. And I think that period of time will be like any other period when humans go through a crisis, like a war or an earthquake or a famine or a plague. People will rejoice. We will be greatly relieved to see the other side of it. And I think that'll be a little bit like the roaring 20s of the 21st century, like the roaring 20s of the 20th century after the 19 pandemic. And last, you asked about some changes. You alluded to mRNA. I think in the long term, there are not going to be so many changes. But in the intermediate term, I think we're going to see all kinds of changes in our political life. Plagues are often very disruptive politically. I think we're going to see an entrepreneurship, a kind of boom in entrepreneurship. I think this mRNA platform and the Zoom technology that you mentioned are here to stay and are going to change our lives. I think the hospitality industry is eventually going to recover, will return to where it was. But in the short term, I think we're going to see a lot of changes in how people use hotels and restaurants and airports. So there are going to be some changes in the way we live over the next 5 years or 10 years, but eventually it will end. I need to say one other thing. There's this joke, I don't know if you guys know it, that surgeons have this joke, bleeding during surgery is very stressful for surgeons. And finding what's bleeding is very stressful. And of course, the bleeding is very bad for the patient. This is not a good thing. So the surgeons have a kind of a wry saying, which is that all bleeding stops eventually. Now, of course, what they mean is that eventually you get a control of the bleeding. And if you don't, the patient dies and then it stops anyway. So try to calm down and try to deal with the situation. And it's a bit of a right thing. But the application to plagues is that all plagues end eventually. The plague is going to end. What we really care about is how does it end? Like, what do we do between now and that end that is ideal from our perspective, that minimizes the loss of life and the disruption that is being caused to us by this infinitesimal thing?
It's a little like climate change. The Earth will remain. We may not.
Yes. The Earth will heal eventually from climate. It will. Over hundreds of thousands of years, it will return to where it was. That's hardly a consolation.
That's right. We won't be here to see it.
How does it end? And also, what do we do next? I know we're getting close to our time, but I can't resist asking you to just opine. It seems historically these major disasters like plagues also precipitate changes in our healthcare system, right? And how we adjust to deal with it, both in public health and in individual care delivery. And certainly 2020 and 2021 shone a very bright light on health disparities and health inequity. At the same time that millions of people probably had the experience for the first time in their adult lives of getting a healthcare service in the form of a vaccine or even a test without having to show an insurance card or citizenship card or put money on the table. If you look forward with your kind of forecasting eye, do you see any major changes in our healthcare system or our public health infrastructure that will be the legacy in a positive way of this?
Well, I mean, after the 1918 pandemic, there was huge improvements in microbiology. The the science of microbiology got a big boost. Public health investments got a big boost. People treated infectious diseases differently. Of course, there was a ton of research on antibiotics that began in the 1930s with the discovery of many of the sulfonamides and then the penicillin antibiotics. So I think, and as you already alluded to, there's this mRNA vaccine technology, plus the adenovirus vaccine technology, plus the recognition of the importance of testing in a public health system. I think money will be redirected in these rational ways. I think we've already talked about some of the pragmatics. People are going to begin to question, why are so many healthcare services tied to insurance? Practices are tied to insurance. You don't really need to see the doctor personally for a prescription refill. Why don't you just do a Zoom call? Or many things can be done by Zoom more efficiently, benefiting the doctor and the patient. Licensing regulations, all those were suspended. I have my medical license in a couple of states, Massachusetts and Connecticut. Really, why? Why do I have to remain licensed in 2 states? I mean, this is a relic of a time when there was a lot of quack doctors and states were trying to keep unqualified doctors out from it. We don't have that system anymore. We don't need to stick with state-based licensure. There should be just like your driver's license. You can take your driver's license, it's in one state, and you're allowed to drive it in other states, So I think there are going to be a lot of these, I would call them intermediate kind of impacts, like we just discussed. The bigger impacts, I think, will have to do with how the healthcare system is perceived. Like for example, if there are political changes in our country, and often plagues lead to a kind of leftward tilt in politics, with a proviso that the government has to be competent. If the government is competent in dealing with it. Anyway, I discussed this in the book, but things like that. I think worker demands rise after plagues. I think this, as you alluded to, this demonstration that, hey, I could get free healthcare and that was pretty nice. Maybe other things should be free too, not just things related to contagious diseases. Maybe not just for the elderly. Maybe that will provide some political oomph and demands by the citizenry for a different way of covering the expense of healthcare. And that would, of course, radically reshape how we do our business in healthcare. So yes, I think some of these things may happen, and some of them are already happening over the short term. So I do think there will be a legacy of this plague on our healthcare system, and not just on the health of the public.
We've been speaking today with Yale sociologist and epidemiologist Dr. Nicholas Christakis, director of the Human Nature Lab and co-director of Yale Institute for Network Science. He's the author of Apollo's Arrow, The Profound and Enduring Impact on Coronavirus on the Way We Live. You can learn more about his groundbreaking work by going to www.humannaturelab.net. And you can follow him on Twitter at @NAChristakis. Nicholas, we want to thank you for your deep intellectual curiosity, for providing insights into what drives the human behaviors around health, and for joining us today on Conversations on Healthcare.
Mark and Margaret, thank you so much for having me, and good luck.
Thank you. And you continue to follow your work. Thanks so much.